welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. Welcome to episode 23, and let's begin the book of Exodus. Let's just dive right in. Verse 1, Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Some places will say 75. Because it counts the people Joseph had in Egypt as well. And so Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died and all of his brothers in that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, a couple of things. One, I like timelines. I like kind of knowing how much time has passed. And so one of the things that you might want to consider here is that when Jacob dies, they have already been in the land for 17 years, all right? That's how long they've been in Egypt. Now, this point here from Genesis 49 all the way to Exodus 1, where we're going to have the birth of Moses, 333 years pass, all right? 333 years, you add 17 to that, you're going to get 350, and so it doesn't matter. I can tell you more about that later. I can put it in the notes for you. But 333 years have passed between the end of chapter 49 when Jacob dies and now the birth of Moses, 333 years. So that's an interesting thing because remember, they're going to be in Egypt for a total of 430 years. Now, this is what I told you a few days ago. Look at verse 8, chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. I told you that I grew up being taught that the people of Israel had been slaves in Egypt for 430 years. That's not the case. They had lived in Egypt for a total of 430 years, of which part of that they were slaves. We don't know how long that was, but theoretically, it's right around this time, so 300 years or something. And look at what he says here in verse 9. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Let's deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them, this will come up again later, to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel to work as slaves. So this is where we see that this is being treated wickedly, being treated difficultly. Look at verse 14. And they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whose name was Shiphrah and the other was Pua. I don't know how you say that. Either way, it's unfortunate. Verse 16. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. If it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the male children live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they give birth vigorously before the midwife can come to them." Verse 20, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Does that bother any of you at all? I don't know. These midwives clearly lie to Pharaoh about what they're doing. And I was always taught that the Ten Commandments said, "Thou shalt not lie." We're going to get to the Ten Commandments when we hit chapter 20 here, and we're going to find that the commandment isn't don't lie. The commandment is don't bear false witness against your neighbor. But there are several examples of people in the Bible who are godly people who lie to spare someone else. And so I've always found that interesting. And I just wonder, like, how many of you remember being a little kid and being taught God said don't lie? And yet here's an example where God deals well with the midwives and treats them favorably. And because they honored God, he gave them families of their own. And so anyway, I just find that an interesting point. I don't want to make too much of it, but now that's going to be stuck in your head. So pause, think it through, and then you can listen to the rest of this in a minute. Chapter 2 is going to talk now about Moses. And a Levite man marries a Levite woman. They conceive and bear a son. It's Moses. At this point, I skipped a verse. That's very important to this story. The last verse of chapter 1. So when the midwives aren't killing the young boys, what Pharaoh does is he says, I command that every son that is born of the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but let every daughter live. Remember that what Pharaoh's worried about is that a nation of people would rise up who would overthrow Egypt. So he wants all the young boys to be killed. And so these two Jewish Levi people, a man and a woman, marry, have a son named Moses. He's not named Moses yet. He will be in just a little bit. But in verse 3 of chapter 2, they take care of him for 3 months. And when they can't hide him anymore, remember, the Egyptian servants, the Egyptian force or army is coming in, and they're taking all these boys and throwing them into the Nile to drown. So she hides her son for 3 months. And then it says this in verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes, daubed it with tar and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed him among the reeds by the riverbank. So I've always found this interesting, that the command is that these boys should be thrown into the Nile, cast into the Nile to drown. And what she decides to do to rescue her son is build him a little basket that can float. And then she puts him in the Nile, albeit next to the reeds by the riverbank, but she puts him in the same Nile where undoubtedly other Hebrew boys have been drowned. So his sister, verse 4, his sister stood at a distance to know what would happen to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." And then his sister, so this is Moses' sister right here, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child from you?" Incredibly genius plan. So Pharaoh's daughter has not given birth to a child. She is not able at this point to nurse Moses. So Moses' sister stands nearby and she goes, "Oh, you found a baby? Would you like me to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse him?" And so she is able to go get Moses' mother to nurse him and take care of him until Moses is weaned, which we talked about a couple of days ago. In the Jewish culture, in a culture prior to refrigeration and in a culture prior to formula, would have been a couple of years probably. And so she gets to raise Moses for a couple of years. And then it says this in verse 10, when the child grew up, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So Moses is going to live as a child of Pharaoh's daughter. That's how he's going to be raised. And it's very interesting here because based on the account in Exodus, the way that we read it here, let me just dive in here and read it, and I'll explain it here in just a second. But look at verse 11, chapter 2. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to the people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man, "Why are you striking your companion?" The one in the wrong answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely this thing has been known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So that's the whole story of this. It's 5 verses long, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And these 5 verses don't shape for us the entire story. So we really need to read Acts 7 and Hebrews 11 to get the whole picture here. So a couple of things to consider. Acts 7, 23 through 29 tells us that when Moses was about 40 years old, he went out to sea. So this gives us an age here, which we don't see in Exodus. When he was about 40 years old, he went out to see how the people of God were being treated. And he didn't like how they were being treated. In fact, I'm going to jump over really quickly now to Hebrews 11, 23 through 26, where it tells us when he was in verse 24, Hebrews 11, 24, it says that when Moses had grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25 says he opted to be mistreated with the people of God. That's what he chose. And verse 26 tells us of Hebrews 11, because he considered being reproached, hated, mocked for the sake of Christ was greater than all the treasures of Egypt. So let's put this all together now. When Moses is about 40 years old, he goes out to see how the Hebrew people are being treated. He does not like how they're being treated, and he decides, I'm done being part of Pharaoh's house, and I'm going to be mistreated along with the people of God. I'm a Hebrew. I'm going to join the Hebrews in their plight. And in the midst of joining the Hebrews in their plight, he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, and he kills the Egyptian man. Now, back in Acts 7:25, it says this, that when Moses killed the Egyptian man, He supposed that the Israelites would know, that the Hebrews would know that God had sent him to be their deliverer, to bring them salvation, but they didn't get it. So I want you to catch this. It isn't here in these 5 verses for us. These 5 verses tell only a piece of the story. But Moses grows up, raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, at about 40 years old, goes to see what's going on with the Israelites, sees that they're being mistreated and abused, decides to be mistreated and abused along with them because he considers being cursed for the sake of Christ, the Messiah, better than all the treasures of Egypt. In the midst of submitting himself to being abused along with the rest of the Hebrew people, he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man, and he kills the Egyptian man, supposing that his people, the Hebrews, would understand that God had sent him to bring them salvation, but they didn't get it, which tells us Moses already knew what God had appointed him to do. Moses already knew what God had instructed him to do. Moses knew that God had sent him to bring salvation to these people. So the next day when he says to them, hey, why are you fighting? These 2 Hebrew men are fighting, and the one in the wrong says to him, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Now we go back to Acts chapter 7, and if you keep reading in there, you're going to find that these people are going, we don't want you to be ruler and judge over us. And yet when Moses comes back, he will be ruler and judge over them. But they didn't get it at this point. Really cool stuff to talk about there. We will do that in a couple of days. And so to understand the fullness of these 5 verses, and it's crazy, isn't it? There are 5 verses here that tell this story of Moses seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, 2 Hebrews fighting, killing the Egyptian, running away. 5 verses. And yet we need Acts 7 and Hebrews 11 to round this out for us so that we can see the whole picture. This is why it matters that we understand the Bible as a whole and not just individual little pieces of it, because you would never think that, or you wouldn't know just from the story in Exodus that Moses forsook being called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. You wouldn't know just from the story in Exodus that he was looking forward to the reward of Christ as a greater treasure than the reward of Egypt. You wouldn't know just from the story in Exodus that Moses already knew that God had sent him to be their rescuer and their provider of salvation. And yet Hebrews 11 and Acts 7 rounds that picture out for us. So Moses flees, he goes to Midian, and join me in verse 16 of chapter 2. It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. The shepherds came down and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them. We see a theme here, right? And watered their flock. And when they came to the house of their father Reuel, which he'll also be called Jethro in later chapters. So Reuel Reuel and then Jethro. He said, how is it that you come home so soon today? They said, an Egyptian man delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said, where is this man? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread here. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And Moses was given his daughter Zipporah as a wife. She gave birth to a son, and they called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days, look at these last few verses of chapter 2. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried for help, and their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant. And we're going to see this repeated a lot with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Keep that in mind. These people in this story in Exodus 2, these people in Egypt are bearing the benefit of God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The blessing that they're about to receive. Remember back in Genesis 15, something like verses 13 through 15, God had told Abraham, your descendants are going to be in a foreign land, not their own, for about 400 years, and then I will rescue them. And so that is now taking place. God is remembering the covenant, remembering the oath he swore to Abraham, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So God knows it's time. And that is very important because God is keeping his promise to Abraham, and God keeps his promises, which is something that you and I can bank on. And so that takes care of us for the introduction to Exodus. Join me tomorrow as we embark on lesson number 24. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.